Hey guys, tonight we journey to a place few travelers would have found on a map. And even fewer would have dared to enter without an invite. You're standing at the edge of an ancient city carved from red earth, its walls whispering stories in the hush of twilight. The sky above is the kind of soft purple that makes your eyes heavy. The air is thick with the slow heat of the day melting into night, and there's a faint metallic tang in your nose. Beneath your bare feet, cool, hard-packed earth, maybe laterite, maybe magic. It's hard to tell out here. The walls rise beside you, not stone, not brick, but layers upon layers of rammed earth, so carefully pressed in a line that they seem to hum. Here in the heart of the Edo people's world, the Kingdom of Benin once pulsed with bronze, ritual, and royal decree. You probably wouldn't survive as a casual tourist here a few centuries ago, but tonight, you're just a floating thought drifting past the gates. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your slow approach along what used to be one of the most impressive engineered structures on Earth. Yes, seriously, even though no one's throwing that into your high school textbooks, some scholars have ranked the walls and moat systems of Benin as rivaling or even surpassing the Great Wall of China in total volume moved. That's a whole lot of dirt, with nothing but hand tools, woven baskets, and what we can only assume was a staggering number of very tired workers. These were not stone walls shining in the sun like Roman aqueducts. They didn't need to be. The Kingdom of Benin, which rose to prominence between the 11th and 15th centuries, used the material it had in abundance. Laterite rich, red earth, compacted again and again into towering ridges that looped around villages, quartered districts, and most importantly, the sacred palace of the Oba. That's the king, by the way, and not your typical monarch. The Oba was believed to be divine, a living link to the gods. That meant every foot of wall wasn't just construction, it was cosmology, politics, and power baked into the soil. As you trudge through the heat-soaked dust near where those walls once stood, your mind drifts. You try to picture it. Giant loops of ditch and embankment stretching over 15,000 kilometers in total. No, that's not a typo. According to Guinness World Records, which, let's be honest, sometimes stretches things, this system was one of the longest earthworks in the world. But historians still argue whether that figure's legit. Were the measurements exaggerated? Do we count every tiny village ditch? Or just the massive city fortifications? Honestly, by the time you're hearing this, someone's probably written another paper with a completely different number. That's academia, baby. You find yourself brushing a palm against a rough section of wall that's somehow still standing. The surface is pitted, sun-baked, and streaked with darker smudges. Maybe old fire damage, maybe just centuries of storms. The patterns almost look intentional, like the ridges of a fingerprint. A kingdom's fingerprint. Bronze glints nearby. At least you think it's bronze. The light's low and your eyelids are doing that thing where they keep drifting shut, only to snap open again. But let's pretend the bronzes. Ah yes, Benin is famous for them. Intricate plaques, busts, and decorative pieces forged with lost wax casting. And here's the twist. While the rest of the world mostly used bronze for weapons, the Edo people poured theirs into art. Imagine walking through a capital where walls rise high and dry around you, while your eyes catch shimmer after shimmer of ceremonial brass and bronze plaques affixed to palace columns. They weren't just decorative, they told stories. They reminded subjects of the Oba's might, his divine right, and subtly, that he's watching you. Always. You reach a bend in the wall where fireflies blink lazily in and out of view. The air smells faintly of crushed leaves and something metallic, like coins warmed by the sun. A monkey chatters faintly in the trees above. Or maybe it's just a sleepy part of your brain making noise. The deeper you walk, the more the walls seem to breathe. It's a trick of the night air, but part of you believes they're alive. Maybe it's because some locals still whisper that the walls were mixed with more than soil, offerings, charms, even blood. The fringe theory here, that the spirit of the city, called Ehai, is locked into the earth itself, watching over the descendants of the Edo people. There's even an old tale, like apocryphal, that the first trench for the city was dug by a mythical giant who could clear a mile in a single night, guided by sacred dreams. It's the kind of thing that makes zero sense in daylight, but right now, it feels perfectly logical. As you walk the perimeter of what used to be the royal quarter, the wall curves again, forming a strange, almost serpentine loop. You realize this wasn't a mistake. It was designed like this. The city didn't follow a grid, it followed power. And where the Oba placed his feet, the walls moved accordingly. Even now, centuries later, your every step feels watched. Not in a creepy way. More like a museum security guard who isn't paid enough to care but still sees everything. Behind you, the shadows lengthen. The sun's gone completely now, replaced by a soft violet glow across the horizon. The air is cooler. Your legs heavier. A quiet rhythm begins to echo. Maybe drums from long ago. Maybe your heartbeat. You lean against the wall, and for a second you swear you feel a faint vibration. It's probably nothing, or maybe it's the past, still pulsing under the red dust. You wake, or maybe you never quite fell asleep, at the base of a wall that doesn't look like much to modernize. It's a ridge, really. A rise in the earth that curves gently away, flanked by low brush and the occasional curious lizard. But you're not fooled. This wall isn't dead. It's resting. And before you stretch your legs, you glance up at the forest, crowding the horizon. The trees here hum with life. Not a roar, not a whisper. Just the steady pulse of branches swaying, leaves fluttering, unseen insects chanting. And you realize something odd? The city of Benin didn't just fight the forest to exist. It used the forest to design itself. Long before concrete jungles were a thing, Benin's urban planners, if you can call them that, were working with a different blueprint. One drawn in bark and vine, termite mound and twisted root. You picture it. Centuries ago, elders standing knee-deep in forest undergrowth, notching trees and murmuring to the gods about where the next walls would go. See, the forests of what is now southern Nigeria weren't obstacles. They were collaborators. The layout of Benin City followed the contours of nature, wrapping around the thickest groves, tracing the soft edges of streams and termite hills. Roads didn't slice through the landscape. They meandered, glided, curved like dancers around trees that had stood long before the first Oba. It wasn't laziness, it was reverence and practicality. Why chop down a 100-year-old Iroko tree just to make a path straighter? Better to curve the city with the tree at its center. Maybe offer it a cola nut or two, just in case. You scratch at your arm, brushing away what might be a phantom mosquito. These forests, after all, were, and still are, alive with motion. The deeper you walked into Benin in its heyday, the more the jungle wrapped around you like a velvet rope. A slightly damp, vine-covered velvet rope. Now picture a clearing. In the middle, workers with baskets on their heads, scooping up soil for the base of the city's defensive trench. Behind them, the thick green wall of the forest, watching. Maybe judging, definitely plotting. There's a quirky theory that the walls of Benin were designed not in spite of the forest, but because of it. Some fringe historians suggest that the unpredictable jungle terrain gave the kingdom its signature concentric wall system. Villages weren't laid out in neat grids. They formed natural circles or loops around groves, shrines, or ancestral sites. So when the walls came, they simply traced those circles like rings in a tree trunk. It's one of those things modern urban planners would file under organic zoning. But here, it was more like divine landscaping. And it wasn't just about obstacles, it was about materials. The forest supplied the ropes, the palm oil, the firewood for bronze casting, even the pigments for the ceremonial walls. Those deep reds and burnt oranges, all natural, all borrowed from the undergrowth. Still, historians still argue whether Benin's design was truly ecological or just opportunistic. Were they harmonizing with nature? Or just making do with what they had? The answer, as always, is a polite shrug. But let's be real. Any city where a sacred leopard is allowed to walk the royal courtyard probably had some pretty serious respect for nature's authority. You move again, slowly now, down an imagined street. It winds, softly banked, sloping between two ancient embankments. On either side, you hear birds rustling, feathers shaking loose from the branches overhead. Somewhere off in the distance, a child's laughter, timeless, echoing through leaves. The canopy thickens above you. The air grows dense, almost chewy. You breathe in the perfume of crushed leaves, damp bark, and something spicy. Maybe ceremonial incense, maybe your imagination flexing. It occurs to you that the forest didn't just shape Benin's walls, it also shaped its mind, its rituals, its fears. You remember reading that children here were once told not to stray too far into the trees or they'd be swallowed by spirits, or worse, recruited as messengers by the Oba's invisible court. Benin's government had layers. The visible nobility, yes, but also a dense bureaucracy of spirit mediums, royal messengers, and metaphysical enforcers. And many of them? Said to dwell in the woods. You feel the ground slope slightly upward, and there, at the crest, a stone marker. Weathered, covered in moss. Maybe real, maybe not. But you imagine it marks the border of some ancient district. The walls here aren't visible anymore, but you can feel them. Not just physical boundaries, but rules about what could happen inside. Who could speak? Who could even be seen? City planning in Benin wasn't just about streets and drainage. It was spiritual choreography. The wall told you not just where to walk, but how to walk. And sometimes, if you were a visitor from a lesser town, if you could walk at all. You brush aside a low branch, stepping into what used to be a ceremonial grove. In the daylight, it would have looked like a patch of forest. But in the time of the Oba, this might have been a stage, a place where priests spoke to trees, where sentences were passed, where marriages were sealed. One sleepy theory from an oral historian suggests that wall placements were whispered by spirits during the dry season, then dug by laborers during the rains when the soil softened. It's the kind of theory you can't prove, but tonight, in this half-waking forest haze, it makes perfect sense. You crouch near a stump, tracing the lines of some long-gone carving, maybe a glyph, maybe a family crest. The symbols, like the trees, knew where they belonged, and they whispered it to the hands that built this place. The forest exhales. The walls rustle. Somewhere a leopard moves, softly, with purpose. You lie back against the packed earth, eyes turned skyward, where stars blink through the canopy. And for the first time tonight, you realize this city wasn't carved out of the forest. It is the forest. Trained, taught, domesticated, for a while. Until it wasn't. You stir again, not quite sure how long you've been lying in the soil-shadowed hush of Benin's forested bones. But now, as you move forward, the terrain changes. The canopy parts just enough to show you a glimpse of sheer effort. We're talking about the kind of effort that makes your back hurt just thinking about it. Because now you're walking alongside the reason the Kingdom of Benin once caught the awe of travelers and the quiet envy of colonial engineers. The moats and the walls. Not just ceremonial lines in the dirt. Not just polite demarcations of neighborhoods. These were serious. These were staggering. And no one with a shred of honesty would call them boring. Except maybe a very sleepy YouTube viewer, and that's okay. You're here now. The moat stretches beside you, not filled with water, but a deep, dry trench cut into the earth like a scar from some ancient battle. It loops and zigzags, carved to confuse, deflect, and, let's be real, impress. No one casually wanders into a kingdom that digs this deep just to say, This land is mine. Some of these trenches were reportedly up to 20 meters wide and 8 meters deep. All hand dug, no donkeys, no wheels. Just manpower. Or more precisely, people power, since no one's quite sure whether enslaved captives, loyal laborers, conscripted citizens, or some mix of all three did the digging. Historians still argue whether the walls were symbols of collective civic pride or, more of a we were forced to situation. Let's take a breath here. You're standing before a feat of engineering that some scholars say required over 100 million man-hours of labor. That's right. The construction spanned generations. Imagine being born into a family of ditch diggers, inheriting the job from your grandfather, and your grandkids still chipping away long after your worm food. You reach down and run your fingers through the compacted earth. Laterite, warm and dense. When pounded into place, it dries like cement. The builders knew this. They'd layer it, water it lightly, tamp it down, again and again, until it stood upright. Then repeat. Over 15,000 kilometers of earthen structure across the kingdom, according to some archaeological estimates. Of course, that number's debated. Some researchers think the famous longer than the Great Wall claim is exaggerated, maybe counting every ring around every satellite village like it's part of the same megawall. Others say the figure's valid when you consider the total volume of earth moved. Honestly, the math gets fuzzy. But you know what doesn't? The scale of it. This wasn't a wall around one city. It was a network of defenses and boundaries, concentric circles around towns, barriers between lineages, protective ridges around shrines, even segmented neighborhoods within the capital itself. You wander up an incline now, a ramp of old earth that once led to a district gate. You imagine the gate, tall, likely wooden, possibly decorated with bronze studs and carvings of animals or ancestral warriors. A checkpoint, perhaps, or a spiritual boundary. A place where messengers had to stop, dismount, bow, declare. You picture a young trader, sweaty and nervous, approaching on foot with cloth and cola nuts to offer. At the gate, two guards lean lazily on spears, eyeing him like cats who already know you're going to trip. Behind the wall, a world of rules. Inside the inner ring lived the nobility, close to the Oba's palace. The farther out you went, the less divine protection you had, and the more you relied on your clan's section of the wall to keep you safe. In fact, walls weren't just royal projects. Families and lineages were often expected to maintain their own segments. That's right. You thought mowing the lawn was annoying? Imagine having to recompact your great-uncle's defensive embankment every rainy season. And yes, before you ask, some families decorated their walls, painted them, etched marks into them, planted sacred herbs along the tops. A few even embedded shards of iron or glass for spiritual or very practical reasons. You trip? That's on you. There's an odd little story often told by griots and older locals about how the sound of digging became a lullaby. Entire districts would fall asleep to the rhythm of pounding and shoveling, thud, scrape, pat. Over time, they say people claim to hear the ancestors humming in the trenches, guiding the labor. You smirk. Could be a metaphor. Could be sleep deprivation. You pause by a deep curve in the moat. A hidden chamber lies just beneath the ridge, a feature archaeologists once mistook for storage. But newer interpretations suggest some of these hollows might have been designed for ambush points or hidden shrines. Or maybe just clever drainage. You know how historians are. Throw a dart at the meaning board. There's a fringe theory, okay, more of a local legend, that the very shape of Benin's moat system matched the coils of a mythical python that protected the city. The story says that if you trace the paths in just the right way, they mimic a serpent winding through the underworld. You try to imagine that from above. Kind of beautiful. Also slightly terrifying. The moon is high now, and everything around you glows faintly silver. The walls cast long shadows. The trench beside you looks bottomless, though it barely reaches your shoulder. You realize you're standing where a city boundary once stood. an actual edge of what was, to many, the center of the world. And now? Now it's quiet. But that doesn't mean it's gone. You press your hand into the wall again. This time, it holds the shape of your palm a second longer than it should. Like it remembers being shaped by other hands before yours. You pull back, blinking slowly. You wonder how many hands touch this same wall? How many lives pass by this same trench, hauling soil, whispering prayers, or sneaking home past curfew? You breathe deeply. The air tastes of earth and dusk. Your body feels heavier, slower, as if the weight of 900 years of mud and bronze is finally settling in. You follow the wall's gentle curve, lulled by its unwavering rhythm. Tamped earth, moss-kissed slope, a small thicket of wildflowers peeking through like nature couldn't help but accessorize. The path narrows, then widens again, opening into what feels like a plaza. No signs, no neon arrows, just the quiet certainty that this space mattered. It's not just any part of the city. You're in the ceremonial heart, the district where power wasn't just held, but performed. This is where the Oba ruled. Not from a modern Capitol building with glass walls and frosty air conditioning, but from a sprawling complex of courtyards, shrines, and corridors paved with history and palm fronds. The Royal Palace of Benin City, or what's left of it in memory and clay and night dreams. You tilt your head back, imagine. Tall carved columns, each one topped with a brass figure frozen mid-dance or mid-roar. Benin's artisans didn't do boring. Their work didn't whisper status, it sang it, bellowed it across generations. And nowhere was that clearer than here, where the Oba's palace once stood in regal defiance of time, termites, and tropical storms. There's a faint scent in the air, smoke maybe. You blink and it shifts into incense, the kind that used to burn in shallow brass bowls along the corridor walls. You catch a trace of resin, maybe a hint of dried citrus peel. The smell of rule, of ritual. They say the palace was bigger than Buckingham, if you can believe it. Portuguese explorers visiting in the 15th century described it as a city within a city, full of gates, inner courts, and massive halls supported by wooden beams, so polished they reflected your face back at you. And right in the center of it all, the Oba's audience chamber. You edge closer. No velvet thrones here, just a raised platform, smooth and worn. On it would have sat a man not just called divine, but believed to be divine. The Oba wasn't just king. He was bridge and boundary, voice of the ancestors. Veto holder over weather, crops, punishments, and praise. And yet, he still had to follow the rules. That's the strange thing about Benin's court. For all its grandeur, it operated within a web of deep, sometimes invisible laws, rooted in spirituality, oral tradition, and balance. The Oba could decree a festival, but only after consulting the priests. He could call for a public execution, but not during certain lunar alignments. Power wasn't absolute here. It was ceremonial, yes, but tightly choreographed. Historians still argue whether the Oba had full political control, or if he was more of a ceremonial figurehead by the later centuries. The truth likely lies somewhere between. A ruler hemmed in by advisors, priests, and the occasionally very annoyed commoner. You pass a row of stone foundations, remnants of old shrines, each one probably dedicated to a different force. Rain, fertility, ancestral vengeance, market profit. You try to imagine how crowded these spaces would have been during a festival. Full body paint, layers of coral beads, people singing call and response with dancers dressed like spirits. And then, like a sudden breeze, you remember the bronze. Ah yes, the famous Benin bronzes, those glowing plaques, heads, and figurines that once lined the columns and walls of this very palace. They weren't just art, they were records. Genealogies in metal. Political memes, if you like. Capturing victories, ceremonies, even embarrassing court gossip if you squint hard enough. Crafted using the lost wax technique, they were so detailed that Europeans didn't believe Africans could have made them. Rude, yes, also completely wrong. Because these bronzes? Pure Benin genius. One quirky detail they often forget to tell you. Some of the bronze used in these masterpieces came from melted down manillas, bracelet-shaped pieces of currency used in trade, especially with Europeans. So, in a rather poetic twist, the very metal Benin received in exchange for goods or people ended up immortalizing its rulers in art. You run your fingers along the edge of an imagined plaque. Cool. Textured. A warrior mid-leap, sword in one hand, shield like a curled leaf. Behind him? The Oba, larger than life, calm as the sea before a storm. You wonder who posed for these. Did artists sketch quickly in the moment, or did people have to sit still for hours in regal silence? Either way, the results were iconic. But the bronze wasn't just for decoration. It was a political tool. A message. It said, "We've been here. We know who we are. We don't forget." You step lightly now. The weight of so much symbolism slows your pace. There's a small, half-collapsed chamber nearby, rumored in local tales to have once stored the ceremonial swords of the Oba. Swords that weren't always made of metal. Some were wooden, others inlaid with ivory or glass. Their power wasn't in the sharpness, but the name they carried. Swords that could cut lies, or slice silence, or divide drought from rain. You chuckle softly. Sounds like something you'd buy on Etsy for $200 and regret a week later. But here, symbol was law. The palace wasn't just for show. It was the administrative heart of the kingdom. From here, laws were passed, taxes collected, wars planned. Delegates were sent out. Enemies were received. Some politely. Others, not so much. You hear footsteps behind you. Not real ones, just the imagined march of centuries of attendants, messengers, and nobles moving through these halls. Always barefoot. Always respectful. Except for the occasional drunk cousin during a festival. Every court has one. The air grows warmer again. Maybe it's the memory of fire pits used to light the Oba's inner court. Or maybe it's your body finally catching up to the long, slow pace of history. You lean against a wall one last time, and imagine the Oba himself, standing before a mirror of polished brass, adjusting his coral bead crown. He nods once. The day begins. And you're still here, watching from the edge of it all. Your bare feet slide gently over a worn path now, smoothed by centuries of movement. Ceremonial processions, dusty sandals, royal messengers in a hurry. You're still within the old bones of the palace, but the grandeur has softened. You're entering a quiet part of the complex where the air hangs heavier. This is where the sacred takes over. Here, history stops performing and starts whispering. You step past the base of a crumbled column, its sides once polished to a mirror's sheen, now softened by moss and memory. You pass beneath a carved arch, more imagined than real now, but you can still see the outlines. Elegant patterns of snakes and birds, old symbols of knowledge and transition. You're entering what would have been the ancestral shrines of the Obas. You feel it, right? That slight tingle at the back of your neck? That's not fear, it's just reverence, dialed down to a sleepy murmur. Each Oba, after his death, was honored with a shrine inside the palace. These weren't just headstones or quiet corners for incense. They were living spaces of memory, altars decorated with bronze heads, ivory tusks carved with dense, spiraling stories, and offerings from family members who needed help. From the other side, historians still argue whether these shrines were mainly private spaces for the royal family or open to certain members of the public. Some evidence suggests that important officials, priests, or even favored artisans could offer gifts, kneel, whisper, ask. Others believe the shrines were more exclusive, guarded, perfumed, and closed off like velvet-roped sections of the afterlife. You kneel beside a sunken platform, probably where a shrine once stood. There's nothing left now but a faint indentation and a small pile of bird feathers. You blink slowly and picture it as it might have been. Bronze heads, maybe 10 or 15 of them, lined in a neat row. Each one with careful features, high cheekbones, and slightly abstract expressions that walk the line between man and myth. These bronze heads weren't meant to be photorealistic. They were idealized, smoothed. Each one glowing in candlelight, surrounded by coral beads, cowries, dried kola nuts, offerings to the past. And the bronze heads weren't just made at random. They were produced using the lost wax casting method, a complex technique that involved sculpting the figure in wax, covering it with clay, heating it to melt the wax out, then pouring molten metal into the hollow. It was fussy, precise, and often done in family guilds that passed down knowledge like sacred recipes. One key tidbit: some of the older bronze heads had small holes at the top, not just for aesthetics. They were designed to hold elephant tusks, carefully carved with royal scenes and proverbs. So yes, the final setup looked a bit like a dignified totem pole wearing jewelry and silently judging your posture. You pause and listen. The hum of insects, the rustle of breeze-touched leaves, maybe even a faint chant if you really let your imagination drift. The past here is thick, like warm honey, and you move slowly through it, each step a little heavier than the last. There's a stone bowl near your foot, worn smooth inside from centuries of libations. Palm wine, crushed herbs, water blessed by a high priest. People poured these not because the ancestors were thirsty, but because it showed respect. The boundary between the living and the dead in Benin wasn't a wall, it was more of a screen door. Sometimes you might dream of your ancestor. Sometimes you might see their name etched in a bronze plaque. And sometimes you might feel their hand on your shoulder when you were about to do something very, very dumb. You step into another shadowed chamber, half-roofed now. This might have been the Iwibo Quarter, home to one of the 3 palace societies responsible for maintaining ritual duties, ceremonial dress, and, you guessed it, royal shrine care. These were the folks who knew exactly how to tie the coral bead collars, how to pour a libation in the correct clockwise motion, and what not to say during an Oba's mourning period. Some scholars think these societies acted as a kind of internal check on the Oba's power. After all, if you can't get properly dressed for a royal festival, do you even rule? You lean against the doorway and glance up. In the old days, there might have been a royal musician here, playing a slow rhythm on a gong or drum. These rhythms weren't background noise, they spoke. Certain beats marked events, a royal birth, an ancestral feast, or even a call to war. You think you hear one now, faint and far away. Just your imagination. Probably, but maybe not. There's one fringe theory floating around some corners of academia, a controversial one, that suggests the shrines might have functioned like an archive. Not of books, obviously, but of ritual knowledge. That each offering, at each carving, even the way a tusk leaned slightly left or right, could encode meaning. Memories stored in arrangements of objects, like a 3-dimensional language, only a few knew how to read. Imagine a historian with a good eye walking into one of these rooms and reading it like a library. Ah yes, this Oba had trouble with rainfall and loved pounded yam. You smile. Seems far-fetched. But then again, Benin never did things the simple way. You step outside now onto a smooth courtyard, lit only by imagined torchlight. The breeze carries the smell of crushed leaves and distant rain. You're not sure how long you've been here. 5 minutes? 5 centuries? Time stretches and folds in on itself. You pass one last platform. Some say this was the Oba's final resting point before burial, a place where the spirit lingered, received praise, and nodded farewell to the city it once ruled. People would have gathered here, drumming slowly, chanting the names of ancestors in rising crescendos that echoed off the clay walls. You sit on the edge, the clay is warm. The past sits beside you for a moment. Then, like incense smoke, it fades. You rise slowly from the clay platform, your limbs heavy now, like sleep is already halfway there. But the city waits. Benin's vast bronze-veined heart still has more to show you. You turn a corner and suddenly the hush of shrines gives way to the quiet hum of industry. The scent changes too. Faint metal, charcoal, and something richer. Melted wax, maybe, or the oily tang of hot brass. You've stepped into the world of the guilds, not modern unions with ID cards and mandatory lunch breaks. These were ancient, hereditary, ultra-specialized guilds, centuries ahead of corporate HR, each one with its own rituals, secrets, and rules that would make a Swiss watchmaker sweat. You're now in the Aigun Street district, or where it once was. In the golden age of the Benin Kingdom, this was the neighborhood of the bronze casters, and their work echoed across the entire empire, into palaces, into tombs, and eventually into museums and colonial warehouses far from here. The guilds of Benin were numerous: brass casters, Igan ivory carvers, Igbesanwan, woodworkers, leather specialists, coral bead stringers, even feather artisans. If the Oba needed it, a guild produced it with obsessive precision. Historians still argue whether these guilds formed independently or were imposed top-down by the monarchy to control production and standardize art. Either way, the result was the same: an entire social ecosystem built on mastery. You didn't dabble in bronze. You devoted your life to it, alongside your father, your uncle, and maybe your slightly grumpy grandmother, who could outcarve anyone on a bad day. You pause near what would have been a forge, a circle of stone still stained dark. You picture a boy fanning the flames with goatskin bellows, the heat so intense you could feel your eyebrows crisp. His father molds a wax figure, maybe a royal warrior or a mother goddess cradling a twin infants. The boy watches, memorizes, sweats, repeats. Casting process wasn't for the impatient. First came the carving of wax, then the careful encasement in fine clay, like tucking a secret into a cocoon. The wax was then melted away, leaving behind a hollow shell. Into that they poured molten metal. It cooled. It cracked. It revealed something sacred. You lean closer to a small brass fragment half buried in the dirt. Just a sliver, but the detail is astonishing. A fingertip, maybe? A corner of a robe? You'll never know, but you marvel at it anyway. The Benin guilds weren't just about craft, they were about inheritance. Skills passed from father to son, generation after generation. The bronze casters were even said to share lineage with the very first artisan invited from Ife, a neighboring Yoruba kingdom, famed for its naturalistic art. That invitation wasn't casual, it was royal strategy. The Oba wanted the best, so he got them. And speaking of lineage, here's a quirky tidbit. Membership in some guilds was so exclusive that even death didn't get you off the hook. Guilds had special burial rituals, reserved plots, even posthumous duties in the form of memorial altars. Once a bronze caster, always a bronze caster. You glance down a narrow side alley, imaginary now, but full of imagined life. Children run past carrying bundles of raffia. Someone's beating a drum, not for music, but for timing. Across the square, a woman strings coral beads by candlelight, lips moving in a silent prayer to the goddess of craftsmanship. This entire district buzzed with creation, and it wasn't limited to the palace. Nobles commissioned work, too. If you were wealthy enough, you might request an ancestral bust for your courtyard, or a plaque showing off your grandfather's military exploits. And, of course, exaggerating the enemy casualties. Some things never change. There's a small square here, likely once the gathering point for guild councils. You imagine old men seated on wooden stools, arguing about technique, lineage, and whether young people these days respect the wax mold like they used to. Their decisions mattered. These weren't just artisans, they were gatekeepers of cultural memory. And not just anyone could approach a guild with a commission. Protocol mattered. Some required days of fasting before requests were even heard. Others demanded payment in specific forms: beads, livestock, palm oil. You didn't walk into a Benin workshop like it was a farmer's market. You approached like you were negotiating with time itself. There's still a debate in academic circles, one of those long-winded, footnote-heavy ones, about just how autonomous the guilds were. Some argue they had a surprising amount of independence, creating works that push the boundaries of royal approval. Others say their output was tightly monitored, every casting carefully reviewed by the palace to prevent artistic liberties. You see both sides. Because in the details of a plaque, an artisan could sneak in messages. Maybe a symbol that hinted at courtly scandal. A frog where there should have been a lizard. A gesture too playful for strict royal decorum. Blink and you'd miss it. But the guild knew. And the Oba? Well, maybe he pretended not to notice. There's one particular bronze you remember seeing in a museum. Two figures locked in a dance, one holding a ceremonial sword, the other a gong. It looks celebratory, but if you tilt your head just so, you realize they're both standing on a crocodile. Subtle. And weirdly threatening. You wonder if it was a warning or a joke, or maybe both. You walk past a wall that might have once been part of the guild's quarters. Carved symbols still linger. Stylized eyes, curled snakes, a sunburst. You pause and trace one with your finger. It's smooth, worn down by time, but still there. Still watching. The sun's gone now, or it would be if you weren't already somewhere outside of time. The forge fires have cooled, but the air still carries that metallic aftertaste of creation. You close your eyes for a moment and hear the clink of tools, the muttered prayers before a pour, the satisfied sigh of a master admiring his newest work. This place was more than a neighborhood. It was the engine of memory, the pulse of artistry that kept Benin's identity etched into brass and ivory, long after the words faded. You walk on, the ghost of a drumbeat trailing behind you, softer and softer. You wander farther from the heart of the guild district, and the rhythm of the forges fades behind you, replaced by something heavier. Not louder, just denser. A stillness so absolute that it seems to press into your shoulders. You entered the outer bounds of the city proper now, where the sacred gives way to the strategic. This is where engineering and empire shake hands, right? At the feet of the Benin city walls. You're not looking at a quaint picket fence. This isn't even your average ancient defensive rampart. What surrounded Benin at its peak was a massive system of earthworks, so vast in scale that when early Europeans first laid eyes on it, they assumed it had to be the work of some ancient Mediterranean power. Spoiler, nope. Just local genius, thank you very much. You crest a small ridge, well, what's left of it, and look out across the ghostscape of one of the greatest architectural feats in African history. They weren't just walls. They were moats, embankments, trenches, and ridges, all engineered with almost smug efficiency. It's believed the entire network once spanned over 16,000 kilometers if you include every loop and segment, longer than the Great Wall of China. But unlike that famous stone ribbon, the Benin walls were made from compressed earth, dug from deep interior trenches, and compacted with precise layering. The city itself sat at the center, surrounded by these raised embankments, like a well-guarded kernel in a peanut. And yes, you're the peanut in this scenario. Historians still argue whether the construction was done gradually over centuries, or as one coordinated mega-project under a particularly ambitious Oba. One camp believes it was a kind of generational relay race, each ruler adding new loops, new lines, carving out his own legacy in trench work. Others suggest a more centralized vision, a grand military plan. You kneel beside a surviving ditch. The clay is still firm, still ridged from where hands, actual human hands, scooped and packed and shaped it. No backhoes, no cement mixers, just years of labor, possibly done under royal mandate. Which, by the way, introduces the tricky question of workforce. One fringe theory? The Oba conscripted villagers from across the kingdom, like an old-school infrastructure stimulus package. Another theory suggests that the walls were built as community projects, organized by local chiefs and overseen by specialized earthwork guilds. That's right, guilds for dirt. Don't laugh. These were the unsung engineers of the pre-modern world. There's a light breeze now. You imagine it carrying the sound of pickaxes and the scrape of woven baskets being emptied, day after day, decade after decade. The air would have been thick with sweat and clay dust, but also, somehow, with pride. The layout of the walls wasn't random. Each trench and ridge helped demarcate neighborhoods, clan zones, and administrative sectors, like invisible fences in a well-ordered ant colony. Some trenches were defensive. Others were symbolic, lines drawn not in sand but in effort. You step over a mossy bump and find a flat section of wall still partially intact. At its height, the embankment would have towered over you. Some estimates suggest 10 to 20 feet tall, with matching ditches up to 15 feet deep. Add sharpened stakes, narrow causeways, and guarded gates? Suddenly, invading Benin sounds like a terrible idea, and some tried. The neighboring Oyo Empire. Portuguese explorers with more ambition than sense. Even the later British expedition had to scheme their way through. There's a quirky little tidbit buried in colonial records. When British surveyors first tried to map Benin, their instruments struggled to track the curved and concentric nature of the walls. Turns out, a city designed for symbolic and spiritual protection doesn't play nice with straight lines. And really, why should it? You reach a junction where several old wall lines intersected. In its prime, this would have been a checkpoint, a kind of custom station run by Benin officials. Traders coming in with salt, cola nuts, cloth, or beads would have had to register here. Not just for taxes, though those certainly applied, but to maintain city order. You picture a scribe with a palm leaf ledger, his stylus dipped in soot and palm oil, recording names, goods, and destinations. A teenage guard with a ceremonial spear leans against a tree, half bored but alert. A monkey chatters in the branches above, maybe the unofficial mascot of the border post. Nearby is a patch of flat earth believed to be one of the forbidden gates, only opened during ritual processions or military parades. These gates weren't just made of wood and bronze, they were wrapped in meaning. Legend holds that to pass through uninvited meant calling misfortune on yourself and 7 generations of your goat herd. You glance over your shoulder just in case. The architecture here was not about permanence in stone like Roman ruins. It was about permanence in pattern. Earth could crumble, yes, but as long as the outline of Benin remained, the city lived. And that was the genius, form over flash. Because in the low light, the ridges of the walls don't shout. They hum, they guide. They suggest where things once were, and might be again. And that's the quiet brilliance of Benin's defenses. They were not designed to last forever in form, but in function. They directed movement. They protected memory. They reminded everyone, citizen or stranger, that Benin wasn't just a place. It was a system. You sit on the edge of one of the older embankments. It's crumbling now, overtaken by grass and big saplings. You run your fingers along a groove and it catches dirt under your nails. You don't mind. Feels right somehow. Like you're participating in a ceremony you don't fully understand, but don't need to. The sun has lowered behind imaginary trees. A pair of birds flit past in near silence. There are no signs, no plaques. Just the soft outline of history gently pressing against your imagination. You stretch your legs and let the silence return. And then, with only the sound of your own breath, you begin following the wall's shadow. Forward, further, deeper, into the maze of memory. You follow the shadow of the walls until they open out into a long, cleared stretch. A space that hums with past ceremony. The city has exhaled here. Not to rest, but to perform. Welcome to the ceremonial avenue, where power didn't hide behind walls. It paraded right through them. You're standing where the King's Road once ran, a wide, packed earth boulevard that linked the Oba's palace to the city's major gates and ritual spaces. This wasn't just the fastest way from point A to B. This was the stage, the grand procession route. If the walls were the lungs of Benin, this was its spine. Even now you can imagine the deep beat of ceremonial drums. Royal trumpets made from elephant ivory, blaring out their slow, majestic tones. And behind them, a sea of bodies, moving in precise rhythm. Warriors in coral-studded armor, leopard hunters carrying their striped pelts like trophies, and of course the Oba's personal eunuchs, silent, sharp-eyed, and glittering with ornament. Historians still argue whether these parades were scheduled, like a civic calendar, or summoned ad hoc when omens or politics required. What's agreed on? They were unforgettable and exhausting. Processions could last for hours, sometimes days, with multiple stops at shrines, intersections, and clan compounds. You reach a bend in the road where a bronze plaque might once have stood. Not decorative, instructional. Some of Benin's most famous plaques lined this very route, not on walls but on carved poles, offering a visual narrative of history, values, and protocol. A kind of royal comic strip, but, with more spears and less humor. There's a story about one such plaque. It showed a leopard being tamed by a priestess. The deeper message: power needs wisdom. But some fringe historians argue it was a not-so-subtle jab at the Oba's nephew, who once tried to lead a coup and got very, very mauled. Bronze shade, anyone? As you walk the length of this ceremonial road, you realize it was never meant to be neutral. Every tree, every mound, every drumbeat was symbolic. The direction of movement, from the palace outward or from the gate inward, meant different things. One announced war readiness, another peace negotiations. Still another might herald the ritual cleansing of the land. You stop at a wide clearing, one of the old public plazas. This one likely hosted the Igwe Festival, Benin's New Year ceremony, and a cosmic refresh button. During this multi-day ritual, the Oba would appear before the people, give blessings, accept offerings, and, according to tradition, have spiritual power renewed by the city itself. There's an old account of Ig that mentions the Oba being carried in a palanquin, draped in leopard skin, surrounded by silent dancers wearing bronze masks. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. Just moved like shadows in time with the royal beat. It's said they represented the ancestors. The moral of the story? Don't mess with a monarchy that has ghosts on retainer. Nearby, you pass a large tree. Maybe a descendant of the sacred Okurha tree, the kind used for ancestral rituals. Beneath it might have stood one of the ancestral altars, carefully tended by elders from specific clans. These weren't quiet places for flowers and soft crying. These were active, maintained, sometimes noisy sites where communal memory was fed like a fire. And speaking of altars, fun fact, many of the city's key ceremonial crossroads had mini-shrines with offerings ranging from kola nuts to feathers to, yes, the occasional chicken. One popular deity was Ogun, the spirit of metal and warfare. Appropriate, right? Imagine blessing your spear before battle with a nod to the very god of forging and fighting. One traveler in the 17th century claimed to see a shrine where bronze dust was mixed with palm oil and used as ritual paint. Historians still can't agree if that was a metaphor or if someone was literally turning sculpture residue into spiritual face cream. You continue walking, and the sounds begin to rise again. Not drums this time, but memory playing tricks. Laughter, the clang of ceremonial gongs, a child's voice shouting as a dancer passes. Then it's gone, replaced by birdsong, and the breeze. You pass another point where two roads converge. A perfect spot for a chieftain's audience. In Benin, local chiefs weren't just administrators, they were power brokers, lineage keepers, and event planners. During festivals, they led their own sub-parades, complete with custom outfits, family musicians, and sometimes competitive gift-giving. It's like feudal Instagram, but everyone's wearing coral beads and carrying swords. There's a quirky story about one chief who reportedly gifted the Oba a canoe carved from a single elephant tusk. Clearly impractical, but symbolically unmatched. Was it used? Not really. Did it end up on a shrine? Probably. Was it an obvious flex? Absolutely. You reach the spot where the king's road would have re-entered the palace grounds. Guards here wore iron-studded uniforms, and there was always at least one courtier carrying the royal sunshade, a huge circular fan designed to protect the Oba's divine complexion from mortal UV rays. Imagine the scene, a crowd parting like water as the palanquin approaches. Drummers increase tempo. The crowd hushes. The Oba appears, his robes a constellation of brass plates, his ankles jingling with bells, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He doesn't wave, he doesn't nod, he simply is. You stand now at the gate. It's gone, of course, time is greedy. But you can see its shadow outlined by the stillness of air, the indentation in the land. You step forward, and just for a moment, the dust swirls at your feet like dancers waiting for the cue to begin again. Behind you, the King's Road stretches away, quiet but still firm underfoot, like a memory that refuses to fade, like a song waiting for its chorus. You inhale slowly and step through the invisible gate, not as a subject, not as a warrior, but as a witness. You step across the threshold where the gate once stood, and the air shifts again, heavier now, but not oppressive, more like incense smoke or velvet drapes. You're inside what would have been the palace complex of Benin, and even though the walls are long gone, the geometry lingers. There's a rhythm to the ground here, a kind of spatial grammar. The pathways still know where they're going. You follow one, and soon you're swallowed by what once was a labyrinth of courtyards, chambers, shrines, and halls. Not a palace like a single building. More like a city within the city, a royal hive buzzing with ritual and regulation. The Oba's palace was one of the largest architectural structures in pre-colonial Africa, sprawling, segmented, and strictly hierarchical. Want to get to the royal chambers? Good luck. You'd need to pass through dozens of layers, meeting halls, ancestral altars, court official offices, animal courtyards, audience rooms, and more. And even then, you probably weren't getting in. Unless you were one of the Iwibo, the palace's inner administrative guild. A hyper-organized class of royal stewards, record keepers, and protocol enforcers. These were the folks who made sure the Oba's calendar, costume, and cosmic alignment all stayed in order. You duck under a low-hanging tree branch as though it were once a doorway lintel. The shadows here are dense, even in daylight, and appropriately so. This is sacred ground. Some of the most famous Benin bronzes ever crafted once lined these passageways. Over 1,000 intricately cast plaques adorned the wooden pillars of the Oba's reception hall, each telling a fragment of the kingdom's story. You pause at an open patch. Imagine brass figures glinting in firelight, warriors frozen mid-stride, dignitaries locked in calm debate, animals entwined with divine symbols. These weren't just decoration. They were didactic timelines, proof of legitimacy, of lineage, of connection between the Oba and the gods. Historians still argue whether these plaques were commissioned in one frenzied artistic golden age, or if they were added gradually, each Oba contributing to a kind of ever-growing bronze archive. Either way, they weren't just for internal consumption. They were tools of diplomacy, used to dazzle foreign emissaries and broadcast the Oba's reach. Oh, and a fun little tidbit. Some of the Portuguese traders visiting Benin in the 1500s were so dazzled by the palace that they wrote home claiming it was as grand as anything in Europe. Whether they meant it or were just buttering up their hosts for trade access, well, we'll never know. But flattery will get you spice roots, apparently. You stroll deeper into what would have been the Oba's outer audience courtyard. This was the semi-public face of the throne, a place where select visitors could request favors, offer tribute, or just hope to be noticed. The ground here is smoother, more deliberate. You swear you can still see the faint outline of ceremonial pathways, routes choreographed like stage directions for the greatest political theater in the region. There's a silence here, but it's not empty. It's waiting. You can almost hear the rhythmic clapping, that accompanied formal petitions. The slow, deliberate way a supplicant would kneel, clap twice, and then wait, never speaking first, never lifting their eyes. The Oba didn't just rule. He embodied the kingdom, literally. In Benin cosmology, the monarch was a living conduit between the earthly and the spiritual. That's why you'd never see him eat in public, or sneeze, or, heaven forbid, laugh too loudly. Divine authority must be impeccably composed. And speaking of composition, you come across the ghost of a side hall. The Queen Mother's quarters would have been nearby. The Iyoba, as she was called, wasn't just royal family. She was a political powerhouse, often advising on state matters, influencing succession, and even commanding her own palace and retinue. There's a well-worn legend that one Queen Mother once outmaneuvered a group of rebellious chiefs by offering them poisoned cola nuts during a faux reconciliation dinner. Only her loyalists were warned to chew carefully. Whether true or not, it's a solid argument for never trusting snacks in a royal dispute. Around a bend, you spot what would have been the sacrificial courtyard, used not for daily executions, but for highly ritualized offerings to the gods and ancestors. Contrary to what sensationalist visitors claimed, these rites were rare and deeply symbolic. Animals most often, but always under strict protocols, always tied to cosmic timing. You reach what was once the spiritual heart of it all, the inner shrine to the royal ancestors. Only the Oba, high priests, and select initiates could enter here. The belief that the spirits of former kings lingered, not as ghosts, but as co-rulers in the unseen realm. The Oba never ruled alone. He was always flanked by his predecessors, like an eternal advisory board. Even the walls here, long vanished, were said to have been rubbed with red earth and decorated with chalk, each gesture reinforcing the sacred bond between the living and the dead. One fringe theory suggests that parts of the palace were acoustically designed, that drums played in one hall could be faintly heard in another through a series of hollow wooden channels. Almost like a spiritual intercom system. The idea is debated, but it makes for a delicious detail. You sit now in the remains of what may have been the Oba's private meditation garden. A simple space, a ring of trees, some broken stone. But here, even silence feels embroidered. You imagine the monarch, seated beneath a fig tree, eyes half closed, lips moving in quiet invocation. The kingdom bustling beyond the walls, and yet in this circle, time holds its breath. The longer you stay, the easier it becomes to believe that the palace still lives, just not in walls or doors, but in air currents, in footprints too old to see, in rituals too quiet to end. The shadows begin to shift, not with danger, but with invitation. There is more to see. You rise, brushing imaginary dust from your legs, and continue forward, deeper into the past that never really left. You move deeper through the palace complex, and the stone beneath your feet becomes warm with imagined sun. There's no visible path now, just intuition and suggestion. Ruins murmuring through dirt. But you're heading toward one of the most complex and carefully guarded systems in the entire city. The guild quarters. Benin was a city of artisans, of bronze casters, ivory carvers, coral workers, wood sculptors, and ceremonial swordsmiths. Each craft had its own dedicated guild, many of which were based within or just outside the palace walls. And make no mistake, these weren't freelance workshops. These were hereditary institutions, rigid in hierarchy, spiritual in structure, and politically essential. You pass what would have been the Igun Street compound, home to the Igun Eronwan, the Royal Guild of Bronze Casters. These weren't everyday metalworkers. They were ritual specialists handling materials that weren't just expensive, they were sacred. According to oral history, their founder was summoned by the gods themselves, taught the secrets of molten storytelling, and charged with preserving dynastic memory in metal. You pause at what might have been a furnace pit. The process was demanding. Bronze casting here followed the lost wax technique, a sophisticated method that involved shaping a figure in wax, encasing it in clay, firing it to melt the wax, then pouring molten metal into the mold. This wasn't just labor, It was alchemy. The air here would have been thick with smoke, with shouts of apprentices fetching tongs, fanning fires, chanting invocations. Because yes, casting bronze was also a spiritual ceremony. Guild members weren't allowed to cast without offering cola nuts or palm wine to Ogun, the god of iron and transformation. Historians still debate whether each casting was supervised by a priest or just carried out under general ritual guidelines, but the line between labor and liturgy was always blurred. A quirky historical tidbit, it said that some casters would smear their eyelids with powdered charcoal before casting, either to block out evil spirits or, less glamorously, to stop molten splashes from blinding them. Fringe scholars argue the ritual had origins in Saharan desert customs. Others think it was just really practical PPE. You move on to the quarters of the Ivory Carvers Guild, the Igbasanmoan. Their task? To craft delicate, often surreal reliefs out of elephant tusks. These carvings were more than decorative. They were status codes, gifts to ambassadors, offerings to shrines, and sometimes messages to rivals. You might remember a particularly famous ivory tusk. It depicted an oba surrounded by leopards and flanked by Portuguese soldiers. On one level, it's an emblem of royal might and foreign alliance. On another, it's an encrypted historical flex. Look who backs me. Don't even try. Here's the part scholars bicker over. Some believe these carvers were allowed limited freedom to hide coded messages in the spirals and folds of the tusk. Warnings, jokes, even blasphemies too clever for anyone but fellow guildsmen to catch. Is that true? Or romantic nonsense? No one's certain. But next time you see a Benin tusk in a museum, maybe squint a little closer. Further along, you reach the coral workers, the Eben Guild. Coral beads in Benin weren't just jewelry. They were legitimacy, cosmology, authority. The Oba's regalia, masses of tubular red beads coiled across his chest, arms, and crown, made him look not like a king, but a walking shrine. And coral wasn't local. It came through long-distance trade from the Mediterranean, passing through Portuguese hands. So when you see a coral diadem, you're not just looking at craftsmanship. You're looking at global politics woven into wearable power. The Eben were specialists in softening, shaping, and polishing the brittle material. Sometimes they'd soak it in vinegar to make it more pliable, an odd, almost culinary step that some fringe historians argue was ritual as much as chemical. You pass a doorway-shaped clearing and imagine a young apprentice, maybe 12, trying to thread his first coral strand. His fingers fumble. His master swats him with a carved stick. Not in anger, but in tradition. "You represent the crown," he says, "and the crown does not fray." Now you wander toward the woodcarvers. Their quarters smell imaginatively of camphor and tree bark. Their works were often portable. Royal stools, masks, staffs, and fly whisks. Some of the most subtle pieces were double-coated, sculpted so that from one angle they appeared abstract, but from another revealed human forms or hidden deities. One curious carving found by colonial agents appeared to be a royal armrest, until someone noticed that the armrest was actually two lovers entwined in a carefully veiled embrace. The piece was removed and stored discreetly, and probably admired in private. But not all guilds worked in physical media. You pass the quarters of the court historians and orators, the Ogbalaka. These were the oral recorders, trained from childhood to memorize centuries of genealogy, law, myth, and royal behavior. Their stories weren't recited, they were performed, complete with hand gestures, drumming, and theatrical asides. In fact, a skilled Ogbalaka could mimic previous kings' voices, capturing cadence and vocabulary to reenact royal decrees. It was less about impersonation and more about conjuring presence. You didn't just hear the past, you experienced it. One foreign visitor wrote that hearing an Ogbalaka recount a battle was like listening to a tree remember the wind. Now that's poetry, or a mild hallucination. Who's to say? You finally reach a place that's quiet, even for this city. The Mask Maker's Shrine. This isn't a formal guild hall, but rather a small altar maintained jointly by several artistic groups. Here, artisans would present their tools, chisels, knives, files for blessing. No tool was used in Benin without being spiritually awakened. Not out of superstition, but respect. As the sun lowers in your mind's eye, the guild quarters begin to glow. Not with firelight, but with the weight of centuries. Each space is a chapter. Each tool, a syllable. Each apprentice, a sentence stretching toward an unwritten page. You leave the artisans behind, but their rhythm follows. A chisel striking wood, a furnace coughing flame, a storyteller shaping silence. The city wasn't just built, it was crafted one sacred gesture at a time. And you? You've walked among the makers of memory. Your footsteps slow as you move out of the artisan quarter, and the city's pulse softens again. What you're entering now is something stranger, quieter, and somehow heavier. This is the realm of ritual and cosmology, where walls were designed not for protection, but for alignment with the gods. Every city breathes, but Benin breathed with ceremony. The entire urban layout followed spiritual rules, an invisible grid governed by cosmic orientation, ancestral geography, and divine favor. Streets didn't just go from point A to B, they flowed like rivers of significance. Markets weren't just convenient, they were placed at ritually potent crossroads. Gates didn't face wherever was easiest, they aligned with cardinal spirits and astral paths. You passed what would have been a public shrine, likely one of many sprinkled throughout the city. Most were humble, little more than mud altars decorated with cowries, feathers, and offerings of palm oil. But the power they channeled? Monumental. Benin religion wasn't centralized. There wasn't a god building or a Sunday schedule. Instead, the spiritual world was woven into daily life. A woman might whisper a blessing to the river spirit before rinsing cassava. A farmer might bury a chicken bone at a tree root to ask the ancestors for rain. Spirituality wasn't an activity, it was atmosphere. One mainstream historical fact here: the people of Benin believed in a layered world, the physical, Agbon, the spiritual, Eremuin, and the in-between. The Oba existed in all three. Ordinary citizens lived mostly in Agbon, but rituals were constant bridges between the realms. Think of them like spiritual doorways you walked through without always realizing. You cross a symbolic one now, just a patch of raised ground where a line of chalk or blood might once have marked a sacred threshold. And here's something scholars still chew on. Some anthropologists argue that the city itself was mapped after the human body. The palace as the head, major roads as arteries, guilds as hands, the spiritual shrines as organs. Others say this is a misreading of metaphor, that Benin's planners were poetic, not anatomical. Either way, it's a delicious theory to walk through. Your steps take you into a market square, or at least what used to be one. It isn't crowded with traders anymore, of course, but listen close, and you might still catch the clatter of brass bracelets and the murmur of haggling grandmothers. Markets in Benin were not just economic centers. They were ritual sites, watched over by market goddesses, each with her own set of taboos and blessings. Selling pepper on a Thursday? Fine. Selling snails on a market goddess's feast day without permission? Bad idea. That's how you get haunted yams. One quirky belief? Some traders wore amulets of crushed crocodile teeth to protect against price curses. Bad energy cast by jealous competitors. You laugh, but admit it. You've probably wished ill on someone who outbid you on eBay. The past isn't as far off as it feels. Beyond the market is a tree. An Iriko tree, sacred in many parts of Edo culture. You pause beneath its imagined shade. These trees weren't just big plants, they were oracles. Spirits were believed to live in their roots and branches. Communities would tie offerings to them, bits of cloth, cowrie shells, or carved symbols, and ask questions in the quiet of dusk. You spot a circle of stones around the base. A fringe theory, mostly whispered among older locals, claims that these trees remember old rituals, that if you sit beneath one long enough, it might murmur the names of forgotten gods. So you sit and wait. And the wind does something strange. It shifts directions, curling around your ear like a whisper trying to remember itself. You stand again, not spooked, just acknowledged. Walking on, you pass the remains of an ancestral compound. These were homes where families not only lived, but maintained shrines to their lineage. The oldest male was usually the spiritual head, but women had important roles too. Keepers of certain taboos, dream interpreters, even midwives trained in protective rituals. Historians still argue whether these compounds served more as spiritual centers or civic training grounds, were they temples or boot camps for proper citizenship. Maybe both, maybe neither. Memory is messy. A curious artifact once unearthed near one such compound, a carved wooden comb embedded with tiny brass studs, each marking the birth of a daughter. No similar record exists for sons in that case, which makes one wonder, was this a matriarchal anomaly? A private devotional object? Or just someone's deeply stylish heirloom? You reach a wide-open area, the Ibis Anmoan ceremonial space, where ivory carvers would occasionally host guild-wide rituals. These events included drumming, dancing, and mock battles, symbolic reenactments of mythological stories involving creation, conquest, and celestial trickery. Not performative for tourists, performative for the gods. You might see in your imagination a dancer spinning with an antelope headdress, his feet pounding sand in rhythm with a drum that's at least as old as his grandfather's ghost. You might smell charcoal and dried fish and palm wine. You might feel your own heartbeat syncing with something older than you know how to name. And then, oddly, you arrive at a cemetery, or rather the royal burial grove. Benin monarchs weren't buried in tombs with gold or pyramids. They were interred with careful rituals, layers of symbolism, and surprisingly modest grandeur. The idea wasn't to display wealth, but to integrate the king into the spiritual ecosystem. And Oba's death was not the end. It was a graduation to co-rulership with the ancestors. Offerings were made for weeks, sometimes months, depending on the ruler's achievements. Sacrifices, animal mostly, were performed to stabilize the kingdom during the cosmic transfer of power. You kneel by a stone. It's cracked, mossy, barely legible. But the name is familiar from earlier, a king who commissioned new bronze walls, or who survived the Great Famine, or who once outlawed bad drumming after a personal epiphany. The stories blur, but the presence remains. As dusk falls in your mind's sky, you feel something gentle nudge you onward. Not a ghost, just a suggestion. There's still more to see. The soft soil gives way beneath your steps, and the imagined cemetery fades behind you like a quiet breath. Now you find yourself meandering through the royal processional route, one of the wide ceremonial avenues that once connected key parts of the city. The palace, the market, the ancestral compounds, and certain outer gates. This wasn't just a road, it was a performance stage for power. When the Oba moved, the city held its breath. You walk where royal feet once tread, flanked by soldiers, nobles, dancers, and drummers. The processions weren't quiet affairs. They were thunderous, rhythmic, dazzling displays. Part spiritual pilgrimage, part flex of authority, part community theater. There were leopard skin cloaks, coral bead helmets, swords with curved blades, trumpets carved from ivory, and dancers mimicking animals or spirits. Every festival, coronation, or state ritual required movement through space. Not in random directions, but along prescribed routes shaped by centuries of custom. One mainstream historical detail, the Ugi ceremonies, rituals performed to honor ancestors or deities, often involved the Oba leaving the palace and circling specific city sites, making offerings or declarations as he passed. And here's something odd. The walls of certain compounds were deliberately left unplastered on the outside during these festivals. Why? Some believe it was to let spirits see out and participate in the festivities. Others say it's just a side effect of focus. No time for plaster when you're busy summoning ancestral approval. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or simply seasonal. You stop at a crossroads. Not just a literal one, but a spiritual crosspoint. In Benin cosmology, crossroads were charged with possibility. They were places where decisions met fate, where spirits wandered freely, and where offerings were often left. A calabash bowl might contain a coin, some salt, and feathers, each one a code, a prayer, a transaction between worlds. One quirky tradition: children were sometimes told that whistling at a crossroads after dark would summon a spirit who'd steal their dreams. Whether it was a protective myth or a very specific anti-noise campaign, we may never know. As you walk, you pass ceremonial trees. Yes, again with the trees. But in Benin, flora wasn't background. It was actor, audience, and altar all at once. The Ogalisi tree, for instance, was believed to contain a trickster spirit. During certain rituals, it might be draped with white cloth or splashed with red palm oil, and dancers would perform in a circle around it to trick the trickster. A kind of metaphysical reverse psychology. Fringe scholars believe some of these rituals were used to negotiate seasonal change, aligning the spiritual world with crop cycles. Others say it was just community bonding with a supernatural flair. Either way, the result was the same: laughter, awe, and a few moments where everyone believed the impossible. Now you reach a mud platform, invisible perhaps, but real in your mind's eye. These platforms were often used as stages during processions where nobles or high priests would deliver speeches, offer blessings, or tell mythic stories. Imagine a man standing atop one now, waving a staff carved with lizards and moons, his voice bouncing through the crowd. In the time before walls, the leopard and the fish shared a kingdom. You don't know where the story's going, but you want to follow. The Oba's personal guards, known as the Imobo, were usually present at these events. They were recognizable by their distinctive red caps and ostrich feather fans, used less for cooling and more for emphasizing important phrases. Imagine a whole statement punctuated by a rhythmic whoosh of feathers. They also carried ceremonial swords, not always sharp, but beautifully inlaid. A famous one held in a museum today has a handle carved to resemble two crocodiles sharing one stomach, a metaphor for political unity or a warning about shared fates. Or both. You take a turn and arrive at a spot marked by a faint depression in the earth, a former performance circle. Dancers would gather here, not randomly, but according to a choreographed cosmic geometry. Some scholars argue these dances were coded maps of the universe, with each step representing a star, a story, or a cycle. Others think that's poetic overreach. Sometimes a dance is just a dance, says one academic. But who's to say? You close your eyes for a moment, hear the drums again, smell the sweat and the incense. See the cloths billowing red and white and ochre, like a story trying to tell itself. Back on the route, you notice something strange. A pattern of embedded brass tacks in the stones. Historians still debate what these were for. One theory says they marked sacred ground. Another claims they were navigation aids for night processions, reflecting torchlight like celestial breadcrumbs. And then, ahead, the Gate of Nine Tongues. No, not its actual name, but one whispered in oral tales. It was the entrance used by foreign envoys, merchants, and occasionally prisoners. The 9 tongues refer to the 9 major languages once heard here in a single morning, from Edo to Portuguese to Hausa to even Dutch. This was Benin the cosmopolitan, not the isolated backwater colonial narratives once painted it to be. One lesser-known tidbit? A Portuguese envoy once arrived late to a royal event and was forced to sleep outside the gate for 3 days as penance. Not out of rudeness, but because the timing of ritual entrances was sacred. Break the rhythm and you risked disrupting the entire spiritual calendar. Sucks to be the guy with the boat schedule. You step through the gate, slowly, respectfully, and feel the echo of countless others before you. traders carrying silk and gunpowder, diplomats bringing gold trinkets and awkward bows, priests sent from rival kingdoms, trying not to sneeze during important moments. Every step here has memory. Every footprint might as well be a sentence in the city's story. The processional route ends not in a dead end, but in a spiral-shaped plaza, used for closing ceremonies. From here, one could return to the palace, the market, or the outer world. It was both ending and beginning, a metaphor in mud and sweat and ceremony. As you turn to leave, you realize the silence that follows isn't empty. It's waiting. The city's ritual heartbeat has slowed for now, but not stopped. It's only resting, like you will be soon. You follow the final curl of the spiral-shaped plaza and wander westward, where the sun would have hung low, drenching the walls in gold leaf if this weren't a dreamscape. And now you're moving into a space few outsiders ever saw. The guild zones, the beating economic heart of Benin, and a dense tangle of skill, secrecy, and sweat. These weren't markets, these were workshops, and they weren't scattered randomly. Each guild occupied its own designated area, tied to tradition and bloodline, its walls humming with generational memory. You don't just become a bronze caster, a carver, a weaver, you inherit it. You are born into the hands of your grandfather and sharpen your tools on your father's ghost. The most famous, of course, is the Igun Eronim one, the Bronze Caster's Street. A single path lined with thick-walled, soot-blackened compounds. Their forges belched smoke and wonder for centuries. Using the lost wax casting technique, they turned beeswax, clay, and molten metal into impossible forms. Regal heads, leaping leopards, warriors frozen mid-charge. You pass one such forge now. It's silent. Cold. But the smell of charcoal and melted brass lingers, the way perfume lingers on old letters. One mainstream historical detail, the Igun Eronimon, was situated deliberately close to the Oba's palace, reflecting both its sacred duty and the immense trust placed in the guild. Only royally approved subjects could belong. The Oba didn't just collect their work, he controlled it, commissioned it, ritualized it. And here's where it gets spicy. Fringe scholars claim that some bronze heads were actually made twice, one for display and one secretly buried beneath certain buildings to anchor spiritual power, like sacred Wi-Fi boosters. Others dismiss this as myth, but wouldn't, that explain the occasional unmarked bronze fragment found during construction, even today. You brush past a faded guild sigil scratched into a wall, 3 concentric circles, said to represent ancestry, mastery, and loyalty. You'll see variations of it across other crafts, too. The Ababo, ivory carvers, the Agbedi, blacksmiths, and the Isekpoken, cloth dyers. Each had its own rules, rituals, taboos, and drama. Oh, the drama. One quirky tradition? The Weavers Guild had an annual contest to see who could craft the longest continuous thread without breaking it or swearing once. The prize was honor, and palm wine, but mostly honor. You duck under an imagined awning and step into what would have been the Ababo quarters. Ivory carvers. These weren't crude artisans hacking at tusks. These were sculptural poets translating myth, memory, and court gossip into astonishing relief. A single tusk might depict a royal procession, a leopard hunt, and a divine vision, all in one upward spiral. They worked in near silence, guided by ancestral dreams and centuries of motifs. Look closely at some carvings and you'll see Portuguese figures tucked among the spirits, long-nosed men with hats, staring confusedly at crocodiles and spirits of wind. Historians still argue whether these were critiques, curiosities, or just artists having a bit of fun. And it wasn't just ivory. Some artisans carved whalebone or softened hippopotamus tooth, or even dried tree fungi believed to channel spirit dreams. One recovered object was a tiny stool, yes, a fungus stool, with 7 tiny legs, one of which was removable and hollow. What for? A secret? A scent? A hidden curse? No one knows. But someone, somewhere, thought it mattered enough to make. Back outside, you step into the Agbede quarter, the blacksmiths. These weren't just hammer wielders making nails. They were engineers of the sacred, controlling fire, iron, and the bones of the earth. In many African cosmologies, blacksmiths occupy a liminal role, half priest, half technician, wholly feared. You didn't anger a smith lightly. They made your farming tools your weapons, your ritual bells, and your grave markers. You pause beside a rusted forge pit, where shadows twist into horned shapes. There's a tale, half history, half fever dream, that one blacksmith cast a sword that could only be sharpened under moonlight, using a stone blessed by a river spirit. He tried it once, it worked. Then he buried the stone and told no one where. His descendants still search for it, not to use it, but to keep it from everyone else. You chuckle. Every family has its secrets. Further along, the Isekpokan cloth dyers take center stage. You imagine vats of indigo so rich they shimmer like beetle shells. Dyeing wasn't just chemistry, it was alchemy. Patterns meant status. Colors told stories. Certain motifs could only be worn by certain classes, and breaking that rule could get you fined. Or worse, humiliated by being made to wear an absurdly mismatched outfit for a full moon cycle. One mainstream rule: only members of the Ojiso line, a royal lineage, could wear a particular pattern of interlocked zigzags said to resemble the movement of ancestral snakes. And no, not all snakes were feared. Some were considered messengers, even matchmakers. There's an oral tale about a python who slithered between two love-struck villages to deliver secret poems. Historians still argue if this was symbolic or just really weird rom-com fanfic passed down the generations. You pause at the last compound, a communal spirit house for guild ancestors. Each guild had its own: mud walls, a small platform, a ledge for offerings. Soot streaked from the constant burning of herbs and powdered chalk. Members would visit, especially before large commissions, to ask for steady hands and no egos. You kneel before the imagined altar. There's a figurine here, carved from wood, mouth open, eyes wide. It's holding a tiny tool in one hand and a broken chain in the other. Maybe a metaphor, maybe just what was lying around that day. Either way, it works. Your fingers brush the air above it. Thank you, you whisper. For all this beauty, for all this labor, for all this stubborn, wonderful, holy work. And as you rise, your shadow lingers a moment longer than expected. Maybe that's the light playing tricks, or maybe a guild ancestor has nodded back. Either way, you keep walking. The city's not done with you yet. You leave the scent of indigo and burning charcoal behind and move toward the quieter edges of the city, where the walls press tighter, the air cools, and time seems to gather in corners like dust. This is residential Benin, where artisans lived, where children played, and where families nested among thick-walled compounds tied together by kin and custom. Gone are the ceremonial plazas and brass-slicked forges. Here you find the domestic drumbeat, the kind of history you don't read in royal edicts, but hear whispered in lullabies or the shuffle of bare feet on packed earth. These family compounds, called Ogbe, were like mini fortresses, each housing an extended family. Imagine a cluster of rooms built around a central courtyard, with a thatched roof shrine tucked neatly into one corner. The walls were made from puddled mud and palm fibers, thick enough to stay cool in the heat and to hush the city's endless rhythm. You walk slowly now, passing an imaginary woman pounding yam in a large wooden mortar, rhythm echoing against the clay. A dog snoozes in the shade. Smoke curls from a cook fire. Someone sings a tune, nonsense words and a haunting melody. It's not flashy, but it's home. One mainstream detail: Benin's family structure was deeply hierarchical but highly organized. The head of the compound, often an elder male, held authority over resources, land use, even marriage negotiations. But women held significant influence too, particularly through the Ioba, or Queen Mother, who had her own palace and often acted as a political counterweight. One quirky tradition? During certain lunar phases, children weren't allowed to speak during dinner. Not for discipline, but because it was believed the moon could overhear family secrets and tell them to mischievous spirits. Scholars disagree if this was metaphor or bedtime propaganda to silence noisy kids. You step into one courtyard and notice the patterned floor, made from polished laterite and pressed shells. It wasn't just decorative, it told you things. Certain floor patterns signaled the family's trade, others marked religious affiliations. Some had spiral motifs meant to confuse evil spirits, a kind of low-tech spiritual captcha. There's a murmur ahead, voices gathering. You've reached the evening council house, where elders met after dusk. These were the local decision-makers discussing disputes, land issues, marriages, and community celebrations. Their verdicts were usually final, unless you wanted to take it up the ladder, which meant appealing to palace intermediaries. But rarely did things escalate that far. Justice here was intimate, performed face-to-face, often with community watching. One elder might carry a carved gavel made of Iroko wood, another a pipe that never got lit, just waved dramatically during debates. You overhear one now, a dispute over a stolen goat. Or was it just a borrowed goat returned slightly thinner? The line blurs, and everyone has an opinion. It's democracy, Benin style. Slow, circular, and often solved with shared food. Now you're walking into one of the few communal spaces built purely for rest. The Okun Shrine Grove, a tiny sacred garden tended by local women. Legend says it was planted by the city's first rain priestess, who dreamt the layout one night after seeing frogs dance in a spiral. Historians still argue whether she was a historical figure or a symbolic stand-in for seasonal fertility rituals. Either way, frogs did feature prominently in the stonework. You pause at a grove of flowering trees, bright petals, a faint buzz of bees. It's peaceful here, and hidden by design. Women would gather here during certain rites of passage, first menstruation, childbirth, even menopause. It wasn't exclusionary, it was protection. A quiet place to pass down wisdom, too often lost in loud spaces. There's a story about a girl who came here in tears, worried her womb was cursed because a lizard fell into her bathwater. The priestess told her the lizard was actually a sign of luck. Years later, that girl became a respected herbalist and made a fortune selling lizard-shaped fertility charms. People came from villages away to buy them. Weird? Absolutely. Effective? The line still forms at dawn. Now the path narrows and you reach what's left of the city's animal quarters. No, not zoos. Symbolic animal enclosures, part of religious or elite households. The royal leopard, for example, was kept not just as a pet, but as a manifestation of the Oba's power. Its enclosure was swept daily, and it was said that if the leopard sneezed, a ritual had to be performed to avoid drought. Quirky aside, one palace servant's only job was to fan the leopard during the dry season. He wore bells around his ankles so people could hear him coming and give him right of way. You spot a chicken shrine, a mound of feathers, ash, and tiny carvings. In Benin belief, chickens were messengers between realms. They could carry prayers to the ancestors, or warnings. Sometimes chickens were released into crossroads to choose between decisions. Whichever way they went was considered divine instruction. You look down at your feet. One trail leads left, the right. Which path would the chicken choose? Before you decide, you pass a modest house with an unusual wooden post. Carved into it are tally marks, not for counting days, but dreams. Each night, a member of the household etched a line if they dreamt of fire, or flood, or flight. It was believed that dreams predicted the state of the city. If too many fire dreams stacked up, a fire drill would be held. If flood dreams dominated, offerings were floated on the river. Historians call this superstition. Dream researchers call it data collection. You just call it fascinating. Now you near the edge of the city where the walls rise again. Not the main outer defenses, but boundary walls, marking where Benin ended and the unsettled forest began. These were liminal spaces. A few families lived out here, often spirit workers, hunters, or those who preferred quiet. Their homes faced away from the city, toward the unknown. There's a saying, those who face the bush don't fear the spirits, they feed them. You spot one such home. A basket of cola nuts rests on a stump. A strip of red cloth flaps in the breeze. You don't knock, you simply nod as if to say, I see you. I won't cross the line. A final rooster crows and you realize the city is folding itself into sleep. Not silent, not still, but wrapped in layers, ritual, memory, mud, breath. And you are wrapped with it. You linger now in the hush that settles before true night, just outside the city's breath where walls blur into bush and the world exhales. But something draws you back one last time. Something unfinished. A final walk along the outermost wall where everything about Benin becomes both fortress and fable. The walls here, often called the Benin moats and ramparts, were no single barrier but a system. A network of earthen fortifications built over centuries. Dug with precision, layered with symbolism, and maintained with obsessive care. Not just defense, identity. You step onto the crest of a raised bank and look down into a dry ditch so wide a car could idle there, if cars had existed. Some parts of this wall reached 20 meters high, with the ditch on one side and a ridge on the other. Grass grows here now. Trees press close, but the bones remain. Mainstream historians call it the largest earthwork construction in pre-colonial Africa. Some say the world. Estimates suggest over 16,000 kilometers of walls and trenches once circled Benin and its satellite villages. Built not all at once, but cumulatively over hundreds of years. One bucket of earth at a time. And here's the kicker. No wheelbarrows, all dug by hand, and carried in baskets on heads. You try balancing a pumpkin on your head for 3 minutes and tell me how that goes. Now imagine dirt, for miles. You pause, heart slow, eyes tracing the meandering groove into the horizon. The walls weren't always straight. They followed sacred lines, village borders, spirit paths. At crossroads, builders paused to offer cola nuts or feathers to the earth spirits. A sign of respect, and probably an apology. Because digging into sacred ground was no small thing. Some oral accounts say that certain sections refused to be dug. Earth would collapse overnight, or tools would vanish. Historians still argue whether this reflects myth or poor soil quality. Either way, the workers learned. Don't mess with ancestral boundaries. One fringe tale claims that to bless the longest wall, a priest walked its entire length with a live tortoise on his head. If the tortoise survived the journey, the wall would endure. It did. It has. Somewhere out there, maybe its great-great-grand tortoise still plods along. You find a marker stone, half buried, flat and carved with geometric lines. A directional glyph, perhaps. Or just an ancient game board. You sit beside it and listen. Crickets, distant drums. The city behind you, alive but not watching. The forest ahead of you, whispering but not hostile. Here on the edge, you understand. Benin's strength wasn't just in its bronze or palaces. It was this. The unity of form and faith. Of brick and belief. Of walls shaped not just to keep invaders out, but to keep the story in. Because the walls weren't merely physical. They carried meaning. Entire sections had names. Like the wall that humbles pride, or the ditch that drinks lies. They acted as moral reminders, shaping the psychology of anyone who passed through them. Quirky rule? When a young man completed his coming-of-age rites, he was expected to walk the perimeter of the outermost trench before returning to the city to symbolically earn his belonging. Some cheated by riding donkeys, some bragged for years, some cried halfway and had to be carried back by laughing cousins. Still counts. As you trace your hand along the dried clay, still ridged from ancient shaping tools, you remember a line from a Benin praise song. Our walls are not just earth. They are our breath held in place. Held. Preserved. Carved into memory. And just before we fade, let's remember what happened next. Because eventually, yes, Benin's walls were breached. 1897. A British punitive expedition, all cannon and ego. The city was burned, the bronzes stolen, the oba exiled, a trauma engraved in flame. But you don't end your walk there, because the walls were not erased. Parts still stand. Some villagers build their homes beside them. Children play atop the old moats, unaware their soccer field is ancient engineering. The bronzes, many are being returned, and the city still dreams, as cities do. In fact, satellite imagery now confirms what oral tradition never forgot. Those lines in the earth are still visible, etched like veins beneath the skin of modern Nigeria. And so you stand, finally still. Behind you, the city exhales. In front of you, the night breathes. And above you, stars. Always stars. You've walked far tonight. Across time, through mud and metal, past walls both real and remembered. Your feet may be still now, but your mind is soft with all you've seen. Palaces veiled in coral light, courtyards soaked in songs, artisans shaping eternity out of fire and wax. You saw the hands that built Benin, not just the royal ones, but the quiet ones, the steady ones. Mothers grinding yam before dawn, guild elders whispering over shrines, children tracing dream signs in dust. And those walls? They're still with you. Not just the ones of clay and laterite, but the ones of language, of belief, of care. They held a city together. They hold you now. Let your breath slow. Inhale long and even. Exhale soft and silent. Whatever you carry, worry, noise, plans, leave them by the old moat. The city will guard them for you. You're safe here. Held here. Let your muscles uncoil like the spirals in carved ivory. Let your thoughts melt like beeswax in a forge. Let your dreams come slow, coiling gently through gates flanked with brass serpents and twilight drums. No need to hurry. The city waits. And you, dear traveler, have earned your rest. Sleep now, beneath the stars of ancient Edo.